Hello YouTubers, this is Music Soar here, and this is something a little bit different for you today, and I thought I'd be doing a few different movies here recently and just giving something different than just music reviews and music topics. I thought I'd go into another field of something I really like, and that's movies, and as you can read up top, it's reviews of James Bond. Now I thought I'd do a full movie review of every single James Bond film from Dr. No, the first one, to Skyfall, which is recently coming out, which I'll review after I see it and all that. It's looking like it's going to be a good movie, but I've also, the order I'm going to review them in, I've posted this question on Facebook and all that, and I got many different got a couple different ones. I thought, should I review them in order, or should I start with one in particular? I've gotten one for Casino Royale, which some call the first James Bond movie because of the order of the books starts with Casino Royale, but there was one made back in 1967, which was a Peter Sellers movie, but I'm just not sure if I'd want to do that one. But as you can read up top, I decided to do Dr. No, which is the first film, came out in 1962. And for those of you who do not know, James Bond was a book first before it was ever a movie. First book was released 1953, which that's right. Next year, the character James Bond turns 50, which is huge. Or turns 60, actually, sorry. Blah, 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 blah. But yeah, that's a huge deal. And, yeah. Now to get to some history of James Bond, first off. It was the creation of Ian Fleming, a novelist, who is also widely acclaimed. I believe he is the one, I believe he wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which for anyone who's older has seen that movie. It's a Disney movie, but whatever. And then he created James Bond, which James Bond, Ian Fleming go hand in hand. That's why at the beginning of every credit you see as Ian Fleming's James Bond. So, yeah, now the story of, as you can read, the movie Dr. No is James Bond is investigating operative who goes missing while investigating this man by the name of Dr. No. And he goes to Jamaica, which in a lot of Ian Fleming books it references a lot of Jamaica because he loved the Caribbean. He loved that area. He had built a house there which he named Goldeneye, which is what it is, and yeah. But no, I think before I get too much into the movie, I think it's got to be said that I know people are gonna say it's old and it's all that, but think about this or talk about stuff like, oh, it's 1962. You can't usually, when looking back at these movies, use today's standard as looking at movies from back then. You gotta somewhat also look at what was also out at the time. But no, it starts off. You get into it with you get showing the most famous James Bond thing, opening with the gun nozzle and the sort of and then you get it following him, and then he shoots and it shows the blood coming down and all that, and then you get the which then moves into another famous part of James Bond, is their Eon or Ion videos, which show these girls dancing or whatever in a silhouette and all that, and it really worked well. Like, think about for back in 1962, that wasn't done much in film. And then you get, and this is rare because you get the usual James Bond opening, you get a theme for the movie, And in Doctor No, you get another song, which is three blind mice, here they go, three blind mice on and on, type stuff, and it really worked well. I really enjoyed this part of the song because I thought like using the three blind guys worked really well into the opening scene of the first James Bond movie, which is the three blind guys walking there. Dr. Strangeway, who is the guy that James Bond later sent to find, is shot and killed by these guys, and then it goes into, I guess you can call it the same scene that shows like his secretary placing the call to London, and bam, the guys show up in the window and she's shot and killed and all that. Sort of lay the groundwork, and then the next part I'll talk about because it shows a casino, and it's there, it's gambling going on, this woman's losing and all that. She has this line, there was a lot of dialogue going on in the scene or whatever, but then all of a sudden you get a very good part where she says, I admire your courage, mister, and the camera turns to it and all that, and it shows Sean Connery right there, who at this time was not a well-known actor. He was probably, I think, his most well-known role before this was in 1957, I believe, The Longest Day, which is a war movie about D-Day, but it really showed Sean Connery very well. In fact, he's sitting there, has his cigarette case out, his cigarette, he's lighting it and all that, takes a couple puffs, looks over and says, the name's Bond, James Bond. And that's where that was born. I love that scene. I love that part where he's like, Bond, James Bond, and all that. And it worked really well. And I'm not going to go into the whole stuff of everything that happens. I'm just going to go into scenes that I think are very important to the movie. And the next really important thing is when he's sent to go to M's office. And it's very good, like he starts talking to M, and then it introduces also Moneypenny and all that stuff, and it was a really good scene. And scenes there, because it really introduces a couple characters that over the next quite number of movies are very well shown, and you sort to grow on in a way. But no, then you get a part of the film that I think helped it a lot, showing James Bond as he is the part where he goes back to his room before he's going to catch his flight, knows something's wrong, he throws open the door, guns drawn and all that, and there's this woman there in one of his shirts with nothing on underneath, you just see her bare legs, which really back in 1962 you didn't get a hell of a lot of that. It was something that really was not done much in movies, and I think this really helped James Bond's role quite a bit, like his fact of it being him a ladies' man and all that. Then it shows him going to Jamaica and all that, and it shows the part with the driver where he fights the driver and finds out he's working for somebody else and all this, and introduces some of the other characters such as Professor Dent, who later James Bond kills in the movie and all that. And there's also some scenes like the part that really got me. It introduced Felix Leiter, Pussfellow, Quarrel, and all that, and it worked well. And there's this scene with this lady, I think her name was Lily or something. She was in the movie and all. She was working at Kingston House or Jamaica House or something like that. Some house or whatever. I'm sorry, the name escapes me for whatever reason. Forgot to write it down, but it was a good part of the movie. James Bond, she calls into her house, He gets there, and on the way, these guys try to run him off the road, which he runs the other car off the road. And that's another thing about this movie, is that back in 1962, explosions were not used much in movies. I know that might sound quite like, what do you mean? Like, I mean big time explosions, like a car blowing up, unless it was a war film. Really wasn't done all that often in just normal films, but there's that scene. And then he gets to her house, and she was shocked to see him, like, oh my god, and everything. And James Bond gets there, and once again, James Bond, being the constant ladies' man that he is, he has sex with her and all that. And this is something about James Bond, like, holy shit, is he having sex with a lot of women. And even back then, 1962, for a male role to be, especially as a lead, like a hero guy, being a womanizer, or having a lot of women, or procrastinating a lot, or not procrastinating, getting around, let's put it that way. Like, he gets around quite a bit, and back then, for a good guy, that was not the norm, as compared to a lot of other stuff. But then it busts into other aspects of the film that I think are important. He meets up with Quarrel. Quarrel mentions that on the island, no, we can't go there, Mr. Bond. There's a dragon. I've seen it, or heard about it, or whatever. And Bond does believe there's a dragon and all that. So he goes to the island, meets, and here's another part. It shows the part where introduces Ursula Andress into this film very much. In this part is where she's walking, famous part where she's walking out of the ocean and all that, just with her snorkel and looking for shells and all that. And she starts singing. James Bond comes in and goes into this whole thing of, what are you doing here and all this. But you think about 1962, like, even scenes like that weren't done that often. I think this really busted down a lot of doors in movies of stuff that hadn't been done. They walk around the island, then it comes to a scene where James Bond's talking like, well, don't you have a place to stay in town? And she mentions how she didn't until her father died. Like, he came to the island, he was killed or went missing or something. And then the person they're staying with, he proceeded to pretty much explain that back then he raped her or whatever, and she then put a black widow and said it took him a whole week to die. And James Bond's like, well, you better not be making a habit of that type stuff. It's just really good. They walk across the island, find out the dragon was just an army vehicle with a flamethrower. I believe a tank with a flamethrower on it, but I know kids will go back, watch this movie, and be like, my god, is this cheesy? But you gotta take into account, back then, special effects were very limited to what they could do. Not like today, where you can have a movie throw in so much special effects and all that. Back then, they had, really, personally, I like it because they actually had to be able to act. It's not like nowadays where you can just throw some big-ass titted bimbo out there, no charisma in the world, and tell her, well, go run in that hole, and she'll go do it. And you can just, and they throw in a shitload of special effects to everything to try and hide the fact that the acting's subpar, but no, it worked well. Then you come to the part where James Bond's captured, shows the scene of them going through the radiation place, like, to get deradiated from it and all that, and it worked, and it was a good scene, like, for what it was. Like, that's what I always look at this movie, for what it was. Like, there's a lot of good scenes in this movie, and then it brings into the part, there's a part where he's in Dr. No's sort of lair, I guess you could say, underground cave system thing that he has, and he really worked at it very, like, you could tell that even James Bond was impressed by this guy's place, and that's something that really is good about it. And then starts talking to Dr. No and all that. Well, what, to me, this is a good scene for one thing. He starts talking, like, you like my place, Mr. Bond. and all this stuff. And Bond's like, yeah, it's quite a nice place. Yes, can't remember the exact line, but it worked really well. Like, seeing them, and it sort of set up a thing, like, where I think a lot of stuff like TV, film, other stuff, you could even say professional wrestling, all these other things, could learn a lot from. Like, you look at, even them 10 years ago, they'd be able to do this, but they don't do it anymore. They have a hero that has, I guess you could say, character flaws, or isn't as or it's where he has flaws, like he has a weakness, and the bad guy knows he has a weakness, and the bad guy tries to exploit that weakness, and that's where Dr. No sits down and he's like, well, I tried to offer my services to the east, I tried to offer my services to the west, but north, south, east, west, they're all just directions on a map. And he then introduces Spectre, which over the next about 8 films or so became quite a big part of James Bond. Then you get into one of the best parts where he asks James Bond to join Spectre. And it's sort of like you're building this guy, building him up, building him up, building him up, building him up, building him up. And then you have this part with Spectre, and it's like, well, will he join Spectre? And it's sort of one of those great scenes, and I wish more things, like, you could tell with this movie. This is one thing I'll say, I'll probably get a bit more into it later, but what I love about this is finally a movie back in 1962, which also was done, spaghetti westerns or any Eastwood movie really love to do, is they had a hero. But unlike back in the day, like where they showed John Wayne, Lone Ranger, were so black. It was so black and white. There's a good guy, there's a bad guy. That finally with this movie we're starting to get, well, he's a good guy, he could be a bad guy. You started to get the shade of gray character in there in this movie, and that's really what I like about it. And unlike the stuff I mentioned before, sometimes I know stuff like on HBO and all that like to also do this, is the character faces a dilemma. Like, it isn't like what shoes should I wear, whatever. It's like James Bond's in prison, the bad guy has the upper hand, he's winning and all that, and then it builds James Bond up to where he has to rescue the girl, has to fight Dr. No, which he does, and he has to kill Dr. No, which he does in the movie. And it was just a great scene in there, watching it and saying, you know what, that was actually quite enjoyable, even for what it was now. And that's pretty much the movie. Now, what would my grade of this movie be? I'd give it an A+, I think, personally, because of what spawned off of this. Like, you can't say... Let's put it this way. This movie, back in 1962, I looked this up on IMDb. I'm not sure if this is, like, over the years, or is this, like, back then, but to think, okay, let's use this for back then, let's say. Dr. No has made over $60 million. Worldwide. Think about that number, even if that is 1962. $60 million is a hell of a lot of money. Hell of a lot of money. And it really ushered in, I think, a new generation of fan, or someone who is more looking for that suave character. Also, in stuff this movie influenced is it gave careers to many actors and actresses, like Bernard Lee, who played M, had a huge career out of this. He had like 27-year career. Him and Lois Maxwell, I think, played the same role until 1989 with License to Kill. Like, you think about that. That's huge. That's a long fucking time. to be under one role. And I know people will look at that and be like, well, I guess you could say that, but also look at the other stuff. Q, who gets introduced in the next movie, From Russia with Love. He had a career off this. Sean Connery this built Sean Connery into a star. This turned Ursula Andress into a frickin' sex symbol overnight. Like, took a virtual unknown, made her a sex symbol. She came back and did the 1960 whatever, I think 5 or 67 Casino Royale with Peter Sellers. What else can I say about this movie that launched an entire franchise, which is still going today, which everyone says, which I'll probably answer when I do my top 10 Bond films. But one thing I can say is this appeals to a lot of people, especially men, young kids, teens. This appeals to a lot of different people. So when people look back on this and say, oh, James Bond, it's so corny and all this, it's like, well, it might be corny, but you have to admit James Bond's made a shitload of money over the years, which is good for film. And I'd still go back and watch this over a lot of newer stuff coming out. Like, the people seem to forget this about movies, is movies are meant to put people's seats, or asses in seats. Like, wanting to go to a theater, wanting to pay to go see a movie now. Over the last few years, they're saying, well, movies and all that, like, more downloading. Well, if you'd come out with maybe some better movies, we'd want to go see movies in a theater. Like, other than Skyfall coming out, the Avengers, which I've seen, and the Expendables 2, there's been nothing I wanted to see this year at all in a theater. There might be more coming out. I haven't quite looked it up yet what's coming out, but those are the only 3 movies this year I even want to go see. But no, that's my thoughts and opinions on the movie Dr. No. I'll probably be doing From Russia with Love most likely tomorrow. This is Music Horror. Peace.